You ever wonder why there's never been a truly independent black music empire in America? Not just a label with some hits, but a full distribution network that didn't need to split profits 50-50 with white corporate giants? Well, they almost pulled it off. Back in the early 2000s, four of the most powerful figures in hip-hop, Suge Knight, Dame Dash, Jay Prince, and Irv Gotti, were about to pool millions to create the first black-owned distribution company. They wanted to build something bigger than music, healthcare for artists, retirement pensions, a union that protected black creators when the hits stopped coming. But just as the ink was drying, federal raids hit every single one of their offices on the same day. Computers seized, plans destroyed. The dream of a black distribution empire vanished overnight, and no one ever spoke about it again. Coincidence? Maybe. But if you love uncovering hidden legends like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to Legends Underrated, because what happened decades before that conspiracy makes it all make sense. Before Suge and Dame, before Diddy and Jay-Z, there was a husband and wife team that did what no one thought possible. They signed white pop stars when white labels wouldn't touch black artists. They gave the Beatles their first shot in America when Capitol Records laughed them out of the building. They crossed over into every genre: blues, gospel, jazz, doo-wop, rock and roll, country, and for a brief, shining moment, they were unstoppable. Vivian Carter and Jimmy Bracken built Vee-Jay Records with $500 borrowed from a pawn shop, and they almost became the most powerful record label in the world. Almost, because the higher they climbed, the harder the system worked to tear them down. And when the money started rolling in, when the white establishment saw what they were building, everything fell apart in the most devastating way possible. This is the untold story of Vee-Jay Records, the empire that should have been legendary but ended up erased from history. And by the end, you'll understand why Berry Gordy succeeded with Motown, because he watched Vivian and Jimmy make every mistake first. Let's go back to a time when being black and owning anything in America was a gamble with your life. Before Vee-Jay Records, there were whispers of black ownership in the music industry, but nothing that lasted. In 1919, George W. Broome created Broome Records, the first African-American owned and operated label in the United States. 2 years later, Harry Pace launched Black Swan Records in Harlem, named after Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, the woman they called America's first black pop star. There was Chicago's Black Patty Records in 1927, run by Mayo Williams. Sunshine Records out in Los Angeles, operated by the Spikes brothers. And in 1949, Ducey Williams founded Doodle Records, releasing comedy albums from Red Fox and Slappy White, plus that unforgettable hit Earth Angel by the Penguins. But here's the thing, none of them had the vision or the guts to do what Vee-Jay Records would eventually do. They stayed in their lane. They recorded black music for black audiences and kept their heads down, knowing that stepping outside those invisible boundaries could get you destroyed. The industry was segregated, and the rules were clear. Black artists made race records, and white corporate America controlled everything else. Radio stations wouldn't play black music unless a white artist covered it first. Distribution networks refused to work with black-owned labels. And even when a song broke through, the profits rarely made it back to the people who created it. Vivian Carter understood all of this. Born on the 25th of March 1921 in Tunica, Mississippi, she grew up in the Jim Crow South before her family fled north during the Great Migration, settling in Gary, Indiana. After high school, she took business classes and joined the Army Signal Corps, spending a year in Washington, D.C. during World War II. But she wanted to be close to family, so she moved to Chicago, and that's where everything started to shift. Chicago, in the 1940 seconds, was the heartbeat of black music. Legendary DJ Al Benson ruled the airwaves on WGES radio, playing black artists for 10 hours straight, sometimes spinning the same song 5 times in a row if he loved it or if you paid him. Payola was rampant, and Benson had the power to make or break careers. He launched a contest to find the best male and female DJs in Chicago, and out of thousands of entries, Vivian Carter won. Her prize? A 15-minute segment on Benson's platform. That 15 minutes changed her life. 3 months later, she went back to Gary, Indiana, and opened a record store with her husband, Jimmy Bracken, a man born in Oklahoma but raised in Kansas City. They called it Vivian's Record Shop, and it became a gathering spot for teenagers hungry for music that white radio stations refused to play. Vivian joined WJOB Radio in Hammond, then moved to WGRY, hosting 2 shows, one called The Vivian Carter Show, the other Vivian's Spiritual Album. Eventually, she landed at WWCA with her own program, Living with Vivian, airing 6 nights a week. She became a local celebrity, and kids would press their faces against the glass door of her shop, listening to her blast the latest underground hits through outdoor speakers. But here's where the hustle began. Fans kept asking for records. She didn't have music that wasn't available anywhere because the major labels wouldn't touch it. That's when the idea hit her. Why not make the music herself? She had a record store, she had a radio show, she had access to local talent that nobody else was paying attention to. All she needed was money, and in 1,950 seconds, America. No bank was giving a loan to a black couple trying to start a record label. So Vivian and Jimmy walked into a pawn shop and borrowed $500. That's it, $500. And with that, Vee-Jay Records was born. V for Vivian, J for Jimmy. They brought in Vivian's younger brother, Calvin Carter, to handle A&R and production. Calvin had been a singer himself, so he knew talent when he heard it. The first group they signed? The Spaniels, a doo-wop group from the same Gary, Indiana high school Vivian had graduated from. They'd won a talent show and walked into her record store asking if she knew where they could get a song recorded. She heard them sing, and she knew. She had them rehearse in her mother's garage, got them a photo shoot, bought them a car to travel in, and on the 5th of May 1953, they released Baby It's You. It hit number 10 on Billboard's R&B chart. Their second single, Goodnight Sweetheart Goodnight, went even bigger, number 5 on the R&B chart and crossing over to the pop charts. But then something happened that would define the rest of Vee-Jay Records' existence. A white girl group called the McGuire Sisters recorded a cover version of Goodnight Sweetheart Goodnight and sold millions of copies. Millions. The Spaniels' original version was buried. White radio stations played the McGuire Sisters on repeat while the Spaniels got scraps. Vivian was furious, but she was also smart. She learned the publishing game. If someone covered one of her songs, she'd get paid. It wasn't fair, but it was survival. And it gave her an idea. If white teens loved black music but their parents hated it, maybe Vee-Jay Records needed to make their future releases sound more palatable to white audiences. Maybe they needed to cross over completely. It was a dangerous gamble, but Vivian and Jimmy decided to move their entire operation to Chicago's Record Row, a legendary block on South Michigan Avenue where independent labels like Chess Records, King Records, and Brunswick Records were printing money. They set up shop and hired a house band led by bassist Al Smith. They partnered with Universal Recording Corporation, one of the largest independent studios in the country, and they connected with United Record Distributors, the first major black-owned distribution company, run by George and Ernie Leaner, nephews of Al Benson himself. Everything was falling into place, but they needed someone who understood the business side of the industry. Someone ruthless, someone who could navigate contracts, collect money, and play the game better than the white executives who wanted them to fail. That's when they found Ewart Abner, and hiring him would become both the best and worst decision they ever made. Ewart Abner was small, skinny, and sharp as a blade. He graduated from Ohio University, earned an accounting degree from DePaul, and carried himself like he was the smartest man in any room, because he usually was. Even lawyers said he was overqualified for the music business, but that's exactly why Vivian and Jimmy needed him. When Chance Records shut down, Vee-Jay Records made Abner president of the label. He handled all the paperwork, collected the money, and hired both white and black staff members, something unheard of at the time. Under Abner's leadership, Vee-Jay Records exploded. Calvin Carter discovered blues legend Jimmy Reed working at a slaughterhouse after Chess Records rejected him. Reed became a wild, unpredictable star. constantly drunk, so much so that Calvin would have the cops arrest him and throw him in jail overnight just so they could pick him up sober the next morning and take him to the studio. Reed's hits, High and Lonesome, You Don't Have to Go, Ain't That Lovin' You Baby dominated the charts. Then they signed the El Dorados, whose song At My Front Door hit #1 on the R&B chart and number 17 on the pop chart. They signed the Dells, the legendary group that inspired the movie The Five Heartbeats. Chess Records had dropped the Dells, telling lead singer Marvin Jr. he couldn't sing. Vee-Jay Records took them in and they released Oh What a Night, which became a classic. They signed Jerry Butler and Curtis Mayfield, who recorded For Your Precious Love, the song historians now call the first true R&B soul record. They signed Gene Chandler, whose Duke of Earl became Vee-Jay's first million-selling single, holding the #1 spot on both pop and R&B charts for 3 weeks. They signed gospel legends, the Staple Singers, the Five Blind Boys of Mississippi, Dorothy Love Coates. They signed blues giant John Lee Hooker. They signed Dee Clark, whose Raindrops became a massive hit. They signed Betty Everett, who gave them the Shoop Shoop song, It's in His Kiss, which hit #1 on the R&B chart and #6 on the pop chart. And they even signed a young Gladys Knight and the Pips, who released Every Beat of My Heart and climbed the charts. Vee-Jay Records was everywhere, every genre, every market. Vivian Carter was riding around Chicago in a gold Cadillac, dripping in mink and diamonds, just like in the movie Cadillac Records. They were printing money, and the white establishment was watching. And that's when Ewart Abner made a move that would change everything. He had an idea, a dangerous, brilliant, revolutionary idea. Why not sign white artists? Stories like these are why I built Legends Underrated. So make sure to subscribe for more untold tales, because what happened next shook the entire music industry. Ewart Abner wasn't satisfied with dominating black music. He saw how white artists were making millions, covering black songs. And he thought, why give them the material when we can sign white artists ourselves? It was unheard of. A black-owned label signing white pop stars in the 1,950 seconds? That was asking for trouble. But Abner didn't care. He told Vivian and Jimmy that if Vee-Jay Records wanted to survive, they had to stop thinking of themselves as just a Negro company. They had to own it all. And so they did. They signed Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons after gangster music boss Morris Levy told them their song Sherry sounded like crap. Capitol Records rejected them, but Ewart Abner loved Sherry, and even though he was hesitant at first because again, this was a black label signing white artists, he took the gamble, and it paid off. Sherry hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 5 consecutive weeks. It also hit #1 on the R&B charts. Then came Big Girls Don't Cry, which dominated the charts for another 5 weeks. Then Walk Like a Man, which held the top spot for 3 weeks. Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons were superstars, and they were signed to a black-owned label. Vee-Jay Records had done the impossible, but that was just a warm-up, because in 1963, a scrappy British band that nobody in America wanted was about to land on Vee-Jay Records' desk, and their names were John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Beatles were already massive in the UK. They had #1 records overseas, screaming fans, and a contract with EMI Records, which did business with Capitol Records in America. But Capitol didn't care. They thought the Beatles were a fad, a gimmick that wouldn't translate to American audiences. EMI was desperate to break the Beatles in the US, so they reached out to Vee-Jay Records with a deal. They had a British-Australian country singer named Frank Ifield with a #1 hit called I Remember You, and they knew Ewart Abner wanted it, so they offered him a package deal. Take Frank Ifield's song, but you also have to take the Beatles. Abner didn't want the Beatles. Nobody in America did. But he wanted that Frank Ifield track, so he said fine. He signed a 5-year contract with EMI, acquiring the rights to early Beatles recordings. And then Vee-Jay Records did what they did best, absolutely nothing with them. They released Please Please Me and asked me why. which had been #1 in the UK. But in America, the songs barely charted. Vee-Jay even misspelled their name on the early pressings, calling them the Beatles. They didn't care. They had bigger artists to focus on. So they recorded an album called Introducing the Beatles, then shoved it on a shelf and forgot about it. And then, on the 9th of February 1964, the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million people watched. America lost its mind. The British invasion began. And suddenly, the Beatles were the biggest band on the planet. Vee-Jay Records scrambled to dust off that shelved album and rush it to stores. Introducing the Beatles hit #1. They were printing money. Millions of orders poured in. But here's the problem, they couldn't fulfill them. They couldn't press enough records. And the reason why would destroy everything. Ewart Abner had a secret, an addiction. A problem that had been bleeding Vee-Jay Records dry for years. And nobody knew the full extent until it was too late. Abner was a genius, but he was also a gambler. Not just a casual gambler, a man who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the boys in Vegas. Some say it was the mob. Some say it was just high-stakes poker tables. Either way, he was in deep, and to cover his debts, he'd been taking money from Vee-Jay Records. Lots of it. He'd fly to Vegas with the company's payroll and gamble it all, hoping to win big. Sometimes he did. Most times, he didn't. He also paid off DJs under the table to get Vee-Jay's records on the radio, standard practice back then, but expensive. He even pimped out women to radio programmers if that's what it took to get airplay. Vivian and Jimmy didn't know the full scope of it because Abner kept most of the financials in his head. He didn't put things on paper. He ran Vee-Jay Records like it was his personal checking account, and by the time the Beatles exploded, the company was broke. They couldn't pay the pressing plants to manufacture records. They couldn't fulfill the massive orders pouring in. And worst of all, they couldn't pay EMI the royalties they owed under their licensing agreement. EMI canceled Vee-Jay's contract due to non-payment. And that's when Capitol Records, the same label that had rejected the Beatles a year earlier, smelled blood in the water. They filed a cease and desist lawsuit against Vee-Jay Records, trying to reclaim all rights to the Beatles catalog. Vee-Jay still had that 5-year contract, and they tried to fight back. They released Introducing the Beatles on the 10th of January 1964, and Capitol released Meet the Beatles shortly after. Both albums hit #1, but Vee-Jay didn't have the money to fight Capitol in court. Capitol had corporate lawyers, endless resources, and the backing of EMI. Vee-Jay had nothing. Capitol Records won. They took the Beatles, and just like that, Vee-Jay Records lost the biggest band in the world. But the bleeding didn't stop there. Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons filed a lawsuit, claiming they weren't getting paid their royalties. They left Vee-Jay and signed with Philips Records. Vivian and Jimmy, desperate to save the company, fired Ewart Abner. He walked away and started his own label, Constellation Records, taking Gene Chandler with him. They hired a new president, Randy Wood, the man who had originally brought Frankie Valli to Vee-Jay. Wood convinced them to move the entire operation to Southern California, promising a fresh start. It was a disaster. They went from 15 employees in Chicago to 200 in California overnight. Everyone had company cars. Expenses skyrocketed. Randy Wood started signing more white pop artists, and the black artists that had built Vee-Jay Records started leaving. Jimmy Bracken realized they were bleeding money, so he fired everyone, split with Randy Wood, and crawled back to Ewart Abner, begging him to return. Abner came back, but it was too late. The damage was done. They moved the company back to Chicago and tried to rebuild. They signed Little Richard, who had a young Jimi Hendrix playing guitar in his backing band. They released an album, but Vee-Jay didn't have the money to promote it. It flopped. They signed the Big Three, featuring a young Cass Elliot before she joined, the Mamas and the Papas. They signed Billy Preston and released his album, The Most Exciting Organ Ever. None of it mattered. By 1966, the lawsuits had piled up. Randy Wood sued for breach of contract. They were $3 million in debt. The IRS seized Vivian's record shop in Gary, Indiana. Vee-Jay Records filed for bankruptcy, and just like that, the empire was gone. Vivian Carter went back to radio, the only thing she had left. Jimmy Bracken tried to start another label, but it never took off. And then, the final heartbreak. They got divorced. The couple that had built an empire with $500 from a pawn shop couldn't survive the collapse. In an interview years later, Vivian admitted she had learned too late to look over the shoulder of the people working for her. She had trusted Ewart Abner, and that trust had cost her everything. On the 20th of February 1972, Jimmy Bracken died. He was 63 years old. In 1989, Vivian Carter passed away in a nursing home, paralyzed from strokes, battling diabetes and high blood pressure. She was 69. The woman who had signed the Beatles, Frankie Valli, the Dells, Jerry Butler, Gene Chandler, and dozens of legends died mostly forgotten. Randy Wood ended up with Vee-Jay's entire catalog, over 5,000 master recordings, and sold it off piece by piece. Today, nobody even knows who owns it. But here's the twist that'll make you think. Berry Gordy watched all of this happen. He saw Vivian and Jimmy trust the wrong people. He saw them lose control of their finances. He saw them get destroyed by the same system that had been designed to keep black people out of power. And he learned. When he started Motown Records, he kept everything in-house. He controlled the money, the publishing, the distribution. He didn't make the same mistakes. Motown became the most successful black-owned label in history because Vee-Jay Records showed him exactly what not to do. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If Vee-Jay Records had survived, if Vivian and Jimmy had kept control, would Motown have ever existed? Would Berry Gordy have had the blueprint? And what would the music industry look like today if the first black empire hadn't been torn down before it could become untouchable? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. This twist shocked the world. And if you never want to miss stories like this, subscribe to Legends Underrated today, because legends like Vivian Carter and Jimmy Bracken deserve to be remembered. Before Motown, there was Vee-Jay Records, and they almost changed everything.